In January 2025, the US rolled out its America First trade policy. Tariffs, investment screens, and rules controlling which foreign companies can access its market. In Europe, the Commission is pursuing the Industrial Accelerator Act, steering investment and protecting strategic sectors. Different ideologies, different mechanisms, same logic. It's not a coincidence. It's a system. And what happens when state capitalism stops being a model that some countries choose and becomes the system everyone operates in? I'm Adam Dixon. I direct Panmure House, Adam Smith's last home where he finished The Wealth of Nations. Today, I'll show you why this shift changes how we think about risk, returns, and what its limits are. This is the strategic economy. State capitalism isn't about how much the state owns. It's about the state operating as capital through sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, development banks, and strategic investment vehicles. Many of these institutions are commercially run. They compete. They pursue returns. They are not the opposite of markets. They are embedded within them. For years, we treated this as a comparative question, models to analyze at the margins. But after 2008, and especially after COVID, the landscape shifted. Across advanced and emerging economies, governments moved from regulating markets at the margins to shaping capital allocation directly in energy, semiconductors, defense, supply chains, not because ideology converged, because the world changed. Geopolitical rivalry intensified. The energy transition demands capital at scale. Supply chains fractured, and economic security has become a political priority. The United States, once defined by market liberalization, now uses tariffs, subsidies, and investment screening as instruments of strategic policy. State influence on the allocation of capital is no longer exceptional. It's systemic globally. And when every major economy allocates strategically at the same time, the system synchronizes. When major economies expand strategic capital in parallel, pressures don't remain national. They become systemic. And systemic pressure shows up in three ways. The first constraint is fiscal, not ideological, it's arithmetic. Strategic capital is expensive, and very few states have sustained fiscal space. Debt levels are already elevated across advanced economies. Pandemic spending, expanded sovereign balance sheets, populations are aging, interest costs are rising. Now add semiconductor subsidies, energy transition funding, defense expansion, reshoring initiatives. These are not temporary programs. They are long-duration commitments. And once embedded, they are difficult to unwind. A semiconductor fab cannot be quietly closed. A politically backed supply chain cannot be easily reversed. A defense buildup cannot be switched off without consequence. Only a handful of states can sustain this scale of strategic allocation without straining fiscal capacity. For others, trade-offs also intensify. The optimistic case is that strategic investment in industrial policy generates growth that offsets the costs. But arithmetic precedes optimism. When the next downturn arrives, fiscal flexibility will narrow more than policymakers assume. Not because intervention is necessarily or inherently misguided, but because commitments accumulate and balance sheets are finite. Second, incentives shift. When state capital becomes pervasive, economic actors adjust. Private firms, and even state firms, align with policy priorities. Investors price political durability alongside profitability. Credit markets incorporate sovereign backing. And firms still compete, of course, on the margins, but survival is shaped as much by strategic alignment as by efficiency. Historically, state-directed systems operated inside relatively open global markets. Governments set direction domestically, but firms still faced external discipline. They competed in open export markets. They relied on foreign demand. They absorbed global price signals. That external openness mattered. It imposed hard constraints. It rewarded efficiency, and it punished failure. State coordination worked in part because markets elsewhere remained liberal. Now, if major economies all shift towards strategic allocation, that environment changes. Trade fragments, capital is screened, supply chains align with political blocs. The disciplining function of open markets weakens. Coordination can be effective under certain specific conditions. It is harder to sustain when the external environment is also strategic. And when strategic allocation becomes pervasive, the balance between discipline and protection shifts. Long-run productivity depends on that balance. The third constraint is systemic. State capitalism generates more state capitalism. When one government subsidizes semiconductors, green energy, or advanced manufacturing, others face pressure to respond. Allow domestic firms to compete against state-backed rivals, or match the intervention. Most respond. Not because markets are rejected, but because strategic sectors are politically sensitive and economically central. This creates feedback loops. Industrial policy begets industrial policy. Subsidy begets subsidy. Investment screening begets investment screening. Adam Smith recognized similar, though different dynamics in mercantilist systems 250 years ago. Nationally rational actions that generate collective strain. Each country, in effect, acts defensively. The aggregate outcome is escalation. The equilibrium becomes convergence, everyone deploying strategic capital simultaneously. And endurance becomes the constraint. Who has the fiscal capacity to sustain it? Under what growth assumptions? That's the structural tension. Now, what does this mean? If global capitalism is now structurally state-mediated, three implications follow. First, stop framing the world as state capitalism versus free markets, or China versus the US. The meaningful questions now are who has fiscal space, who allocates capital effectively, and where does competitive dynamism remain? Second, returns increasingly reflect strategic positioning as well as productivity. Capital follows policy direction more closely than before. The most strategically important technology may matter more than the most efficient one. And that's a different returns profile. Third, this system assumes continued growth. High debt, large embedded commitments, strategic competition across every major economy at once. If growth slows materially, trade-offs sharpen quickly. The risk isn't any single country's industrial policy. The risk is the system's aggregate exposure and the absence of a coordinated exit. State capitalism is no longer an alternative model. It is becoming the operating system of global capitalism. But when strategic allocation expands everywhere at once, the constraint is no longer ideology, it is capacity. Fiscal capacity, productive capacity, political capacity. Strategic ambition is expanding, but capacity is finite. That tension will shape the next phase of the global economy.